carrying on reviewing Emily Katie's Girl Unmasked. So this is video number 2 of this series. Okay, so as I was saying in my previous video, I was just describing the other diagnosis she was given on the ward, which is basically personality disorder and generalised anxiety disorder. So the first psychiatrist she saw following her discharge from the psychiatric hospital immediately asked her mum, has she been assessed for autism? And Emily says that was really because she didn't want to see this psychiatrist because he was different to the one she normally has, so she refused to speak to him and sat in a waiting room. Her parents were still desperate for answers, so they reached out to a private autism assessment service, and that's because the NHS wait was too long, and Emily mentions her privilege, obviously not all people can afford to go private. Even one of her sixth form teachers now suggested that she could be autistic. So her parents decided to pay. There were 3 women in the room, and they all tell her that she's autistic. Her friends had told Emily that she couldn't possibly be when Emily told them that she was being assessed. During her assessment, she was instructed to complete activities that she was sure weren't aimed at somebody her age. For example, she was asked to pretend to brush her teeth and to talk to the woman through this as she did so. Yes, I often hear that come up in autism assessments, by the way, that pretending to brush your teeth exercise. I was never asked to do that in my assessment, so do let me know if any of you have had that experience. I'm not entirely sure what they're trying to assess there. It seems quite a basic, simple activity. Just show them what you do, I guess miming the actions of brushing teeth. So I guess you'll be like taking a toothpaste, squirting it onto the toothbrush, going... getting some water or something. I personally do it from a jug. I don't like putting my hand under the tap, so I pour a kettle into a jug, and then I just take, I know that sounds really weird, right? I am weird, part of that's doing my OCD as well, by the way. I'm a bit idiosyncratic around that, and it has to be water that I've boiled, because I have OCD around tap water, and then wait for it to cool, and then I take a sip and go, spit it out in the sink, you know what I mean? So it's just a bit weird having to do that in an autism assessment. I'm not entirely sure what they're trying to work out. I mean, that doesn't seem to me, just being able to, because you can mime that doesn't seem any relation to autism, if you ask me, but who knows. Anyway, so she had to do that, and then she was given a picture book. They gave her a picture book of toads soaring across wetlands and towns, encountering a man, an old lady, and a dog en route. The book was a wordless picture book, and she was asked to make up a story to it. Yes, I can understand why that might be used in an autism assessment, because they're trying to kind of assess someone's ability to kind of understand, stories and plots, and their ability to think in abstract terms, I suppose. I think I would find that very difficult. That's not because I lack imagination. I do have some imagination, although I would say I'm a little bit stunted in terms of certain types of imagination, definitely. But I definitely would struggle with that. I would find it really difficult, I know I would, if I was asked to do that on the spot. If I had time to think about it a bit more, I might be able to come up with something. I think I'd still find it actually really difficult, because I've got too many ideas in my head, and I would just be like, what? I would find that really difficult. I know for a fact I would really struggle with that. I wasn't actually asked to do that in my autism assessment. My autism assessment was really more just them asking me and my parents a hell of a lot of questions and filling out questionnaires, and it was just really a very, very, very in-depth kind of developmental history and looking at my struggles. So it's interesting, not all autistic people are given these, and also I had cognitive assessments later on as well, so I did have the cognitive workout, although I asked for that personally myself, just to corroborate tests I'd had earlier as a child, so I did have a cognitive kind of tests and stuff like that. But it's just interesting that not everyone has these. Autism assessments are very, very varied, aren't they? So do let me know if any of you have had to do these stories and things like that. So that's what Emily had to do anyway. So Emily had to make up stories for pages of toads going on their adventure. Emily says for AQ, that's the Autism Spectrum Quotient screening tool devised by Simon Baron-Cohen, by the way. Emily says the AQ screening tool is flawed. For example, for question, would you prefer to go to a museum or a theatre? Emily says she loves the theatre. Museums she finds too understimulating and too boring. Yes, I'm different here. I don't like the theatre particularly, and this isn't to do with OCD. I'm talking about my general preferences, like what I'd do if I didn't have OCD. I'm not really a great fan of the theatre. Don't get me wrong, I do like some theatre. When I was really obsessed with Kate Winslet, I loved going to watch her older sister Anna, same name as me, perform in A Midsummer Night's Dream, because I was absolutely obsessed with Kate Winslet. So to see her sister, who's also an actress, perform in A Midsummer Night's Dream was absolutely bloody amazing. But that's because that was my obsession. Going to the theatre in general is not something I've ever really been particularly interested in, unless it's connected to an interest. I do prefer museums, just because they're more kind of, I don't know, they're quieter, I'm more interested in factual stuff as a rule. I like learning, I like getting information. I can't always follow plots in theatre. I find it quite baffling what's going on. I get lost. I get easily distracted, having to sit still for that length of time, following a plot. I just switch off. It's very, very difficult. The room is often too hot. I don't like it. I much prefer going to the museum in general. So that's interesting that Emily prefers theatres, and that wouldn't get her a point on AQ. But that is, I do agree with her though, that is a little bit of a strange question, and I don't think that in and of itself is... Autistic people in general might potentially prefer going to museums, but then again, lots of non-autistic people prefer museums to theatre. I don't think in and of itself that question is connected to being autistic, really. So I would agree with her on that, really. That it isn't really connected to autism too much, although there might be a general tendency for autistics to prefer museums. But yeah, it's just interesting that she prefers theatres. She talks about being well behaved, yeah, as I mentioned, yes already, a high achieving pupil at school, very different to me, and a happy little girl. It wasn't until her mental health significantly deteriorated that autistic behaviours she had internalised and masked became more external and visible. So that's very different to me. I didn't mask at all in my childhood, and I would say my autistic traits were incredibly obvious as a child. So very different there. Obviously things did get worse when my OCD got worse, but in actual fact, before my OCD developed, my autism was more, in a sense, raw and naked, if you like. It was more flagrant in some respects because it hadn't yet been kind of obscured a bit by the OCD, because now I've got OCD, a lot of it, you know, in a sense it can overshadow my autism a bit, but when I was a child, before the OCD had got as severe as what it is now, I still had OCD. I mean, I had OCD for about 6-7, but like I said in my previous video, it wasn't 24/7. But so that's what I mean, is that my autism, in a sense, was a lot more obvious because it hadn't yet been obscured to some extent by the OCD, and I didn't mask at all, and that was from childhood. So very different to Katie in that respect, because I did have a more early developmental course. It sounds like hers was more masked, which is interesting, hence the cover of a book I showed you the other day. It's in the room now, but Girl Unmasked. She talks about doing psychology and English literature A-level, and she was doing geography as well, but she had to drop it. She was diagnosed autistic at nearly 17 years. Her parents were thinking, so, if my neurotypical daughter is really neurodivergent, what does that mean for her life? So that's interesting, because my parents never saw me as neurotypical. Neurotypical, it's a problematic term, but they always saw me as having something different about my brain. They knew there was something wrong. I know it's a load of term, but that's the term they used, you know. They knew there was something wrong with my brain. It wasn't ever, I was never considered to be typical. There was always something different, odd about me. So that's very different to Emily. Katie's experience. Yeah. Okay, so I haven't got much more to go now. Just a few more things. Where was I? So where was I? So yes, she went. Yes. Oh yeah, and then she gets a neurodiversity angle there, where she talks about how the autism criteria uses a framework of deficit. She's persistent deficits, and she says, why not just differences? Well, the reason they say deficits is because it's a disorder. You know, it's not just a difference. That's why they use those term deficits, because it's a bloody serious thing. So I completely disagree with her about that. As you know, my take on the neurodiversity movement. She talks about, and then she says restricted interest. She says, why not just focused with ability to hyperfixate? Because, again, they're restricted. Because it's an impairment. Because it's a serious disorder warranting support. I disagree with her there. And then she talks about, and I also use the word impaired functioning. Well, because it is an impairment. And then she makes a sort of joke, I don't find it particularly funny. She says, imagine that we describe neurotypicals in such terms and place the criteria in a manual of mental disorders. Neurotypical spectrum disorder, persistent difficulties in recognising that deficits are not deficits but differences, for example. Yeah, I find it weird when these neurodiversity activists do that. I don't find it funny. I just think it's trivialising autism and sending out the wrong messages. Autism is a disorder. And just leave it there. It's a disorder. There's nothing wrong with a disorder. And neurotypicals is a problematic term. Who is really typical at the end of the day? But you know what I mean, for want of a better word. They don't have a disorder. I mean, they might have a disorder. They might have something else. There are many other disorders you can have, physical and mental. But assuming they don't have any other affliction, and they're just like a run-of-the-mill average person, there's being not autistic, being neurologically, in that sense, like typical, for a better word, without mental problems or anything like that, that's not a disorder. So let's just leave it there. I mean, you know what I mean? It just trivialises autism, and I don't really find that funny. I just find it a bit grating and a little bit offensive. But and then she says, do we know what a thriving autistic looks like? In a world that caters for their sensory needs, for example, her functioning wasn't impaired when she was a little girl. Very interesting indeed. My functioning was severely impaired when I was a little girl. I don't understand that at all. And that's why she wasn't diagnosed until she was 16. Very interesting. As I say, I was very impaired from about 2 to 3, so if not earlier. So yes, that is an interesting analysis. She says we only diagnose autism in struggling people. Do we really? Well, yes. I mean, we diagnose it when you're struggling, right? But that's because of the autism, not because of mental problems. That's separate. It's interesting that Emily is often told she sounds posh. She talks about the autism accent. She mentions difficulties recognising faces. For example, when she sees someone out of context uptown, when they say hi, she might not always recognise them. Yeah, I can relate to that myself. That happens to me a lot as well. And then she talks about her ADHD diagnosis, which was diagnosed later, aged 21. And she talks about speaking fast. She says she speaks at such a speed to keep up with the pace of her brain. And she talks about things that she does that are apparently rude. For example, asking too many questions, seeking clarification when given an instruction, correcting someone on their mistakes, talking too much, not being able to stop what she's doing until she has finished it. And then she talks about her depression. So she sees a psychologist aged 16 to 18. She attempts to take her life again. But she does very well at school. She gets an A star in psychology, an A star in English literature, and an A star in extended project qualification for A levels. She talks about going to a nightclub and getting her results, but then she has a panic attack in the corner after being at a busy bar. She says she thinks of all the nights that she felt a little less impossible to get through because she would see the smiling faces of her 3 friends the following morning in form, so her friends seemed to be very much a supportive presence in her life. She talks about being able to drive a car. She goes to a local university. She becomes a student mental health nurse, and she now is a nurse for children, by the way, in psychiatric care. And then she talks about how the arrival of COVID thrown a spanner in the works of her first year at uni. But she says that people like Kate from the Children's Mental Health Unit have been reaching out to her online, asking her to talk to them on Zoom, and due to her Twitter presence during the pandemic, and she now works as a mental health nurse with kids. Okay, so that's the end of that. So do let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.